I should probably put a health warning on this. You're probably not going to like what I've got to say very much, but it's important that we speak truth on such issues. Mike is right, I am active in this area, but I also chair the Lancet Commission on Health Impacts of Climate Change, which reports every year. That's a little over 5.5 million, courtesy of the Wellcome Trust. And it's partly in that capacity in which I speak to you today. I want to start with the stresses we're putting on our planet as human beings. And they do relate to how many there are of us, and they relate to how much each one of us does. And in the 4.2 billion years it took for humans to evolve, 530 million years of multicelled life and so forth, it took that length of time to reach the first billion on the planet. In fact, 2,000 years ago, we hadn't got anywhere near that much. We were around 1/3 of a billion, around 300 million people on the planet. 70,000 years ago, we estimate there were 5,000 breeding pairs of people on the planet. So even to get to that 1/3 of a billion took 4.2 billion years. And not much happened over the next 2,000 years to the modern day until we hit the agricultural and industrial revolutions. And that was largely because we could suddenly produce colossal amounts of food to feed that burgeoning population. So we reached our first billion here in 1804, and it took a little over 123 years to get the next billion added. But it took only 33 more years to add another billion, and we've been adding another billion to our population every 12 to 14 years ever since. And we've now bust our way through 7.5 billion, and we're very rapidly approaching 8 billion people on the planet. Now, if you look at GDP, global domestic product, which is the other part of the axis up there, this is in 2010 US dollars. So this is inflation adjusted and is based largely on global taxation records, which people have been very good at keeping. And you'll see again, not much happened until the Industrial Revolution, where things really took off again. Same shape of curve, same inflection point, same very steep rise, but the scales are very different. So whilst we've gone up from $348 per person, we're now at $11,000 per person, and the number of people has gone up in that space of time by now nearly 8-fold. Each of those dollars that we're using is underpinned by some sort of something, a resource. It can be water, it can be soil, tin, antimony, uranium, anything you care to name, but it's something that's getting used is underpinning that financial turnover. And you can measure it in any of those metrics, but this is just related to fish. That's what's been happening to global fish harvest in metric tons over that space of time. Those are looking at the taxa which have collapsed over that period of time. So you see, it's not just that we're taking large numbers out of the sea, it's we're collapsing the species and the taxa upon which we depend ultimately for our own lives. The cumulative collapse of taxa is illustrated by the blue line. You can look at crop production. Crop production is going up steadily. We've got more and more of us. We all want to eat more and more. So we're growing more and more. And that line is continuing to go up as we find more and more ingenious ways to fertilize, to add nutrient to the topsoil on which to grow the crops. Look at the number of cattle, amount of red meat we're trying to eat. Now nearly 50 kilograms per man, woman, child and baby on the planet, and still going up as more and more of us want to eat more and more red meat. And quite understandably, people coming out of poverty who've been protein deprived seize the opportunity to get more and more ready access to red meat consumption. And the same applies to water. It takes around a kilogram of wheat takes around 1,350 litres of water to grow. It takes around 3,000 litres for a kilogram of rice, but it's around 15,000 kilograms of water to get 1 kilogram of red meat. That's because you've got to grow the crops which you've got to water, and you've got to feed an awful lot of crops to a cow, and the cow has to have a lot of water, and that's before you've even talked about cleaning and producing the meat products thereafter. So we're going through these things at an enormous rate, and I should remind you that water is not a finite resource. A lot of that water is coming from draining topsoil, it's from draining subsoil, and it's from draining fossil aquifers, which have taken over 10 million years to fill. And once they're gone for at least another 10 million if they're ever to refill at all. So once those are gone, we can't grow crops, and we are draining those fossil aquifers at an increasing rate. Here are some of those data. Particularly look at the Hebei in the North China Plain. That fossil aquifer is dropping by 3 meters a year. When that goes dry, that's the wheat production for over 500 million people will disappear in one go. California, we've drained the Colorado River Basin by 65 cubic kilometers of water just in that space of time, and we're still going. This is a worldwide issue. The same applies to the Ogallala Aquifer in North America, which attends the wheat production for 8 major US states. Many fossil aquifers in the world have already run dry. Hard to imagine though, because they're all underwater. Let's look at the surface water, just as a marker of the drainage. This is the Aral Sea, just over 171,000 square kilometers in 1989. Let's see what it looked like in 2014. And there's little less of that now than there was even then. Lake Urmia on the left in northwest Iran, 1972, running through to 2014. And Lake Chad. Worldwide, we're draining water from the surface and from the beneath the surface to sustain our crop production. And when that's gone, because this is not sustainable, we won't be able to grow those crops. But it's worse than that, because every time you till soil, you break the surface structure, and around 1% of that topsoil blows away. And you can do your own maths, but that means you can only plough a field 100 seasons or 100 times before there's no topsoil left. And if you think of the amount of the world where you get maybe 3 crop cycles a year, or the ground has been tilled for 100 years, you can't grow anything there anymore, and you won't be able to grow anything there unless you leave that soil completely alone, hope that some small plant life starts to regenerate there, and leave it for at least 10,000 years, when none of us or our species is likely even to be around. These were the data put forward in 2006. They still seem to hold true, that we won't be able to grow anything on land on which we currently grow crops in the next 30 years' time, in 30 years' time. And it's not just others who've been saying this. Politicians are well aware of this. Even our own Michael Gove has been warning the UK has about 30 years left before we can't grow anything on British soil. That's really just mirroring what's seen around the rest of the world. So we're running out of water with which to grow things. We're running out of topsoil, and we've destroyed a great amount of our planet in our quest even to get food. If you've run out of places to grow stuff on, you've got to look for somewhere else, and you can't grow it where it's currently grown. You can't grow it where it's too high. You can't grow on oceans like the Arctic. You can't grow it where it's too cold, or where it's too hot, or where the rain and hot cycles are unfavourable to growth. You can't grow it where they're too steep or where it's too rocky. And that only leaves you a few places left. And that's why we're chopping down the rainforest at this sort of rate. 3 years ago, we were chopping it down at a rate of around 20 English football pitches a minute. And under Bolsonaro, the current rate is now 60 football pitches a minute. So a football pitch of Amazonian rainforest disappearing every second. I haven't even touched on pollution, but if you've overhunted, killed the native indigenous species, removed their habitats, removed the water, removed the soil, and put people to live where most of these people grow, and put cities and railway lines, and broken up their ecosystems, the number of animals will disappear. So these data are reported from the Living Planet Index, which is using index species which track very closely with a bunch of other species, so that by monitoring the total numbers of one species, you get a very, very high fidelity read on the number of other species there. So we're looking at the number of animals here, not the number of species, but the number of animals, and we're looking particularly at vertebrates. Start looking at the numbers there. They've taken 1970 as the index because that's when things were first counted. So the index then was 1. Remember, we've probably taken out a shed load of animals by 1970. But this is the baseline we've got, 1 being 100%. you'll see we're down nearly 60% populations of vertebrates since 1970. And if you're interested, I was 8 years old then. So this is well within my lifetime. Looking at the freshwater vertebrae, we're down by 81%. We've only got 19% of the number of freshwater vertebrates on the planet now that we had in 1970, and we're still going down. But let's talk about species, because it's not just the numbers. If you destroy complexities of ecosystems, you remove the numbers, you pollute and you kill the animals, you will get species loss. The rate of species loss is now between 1,000 and 10,000 times higher than the baseline. This is a rate now of around 8 species becoming extinct an hour. And this is the greatest and biggest and fastest mass extinction this planet has ever seen. And you're living through it right now. And that's the United Nations that make that statement. So we've been lucky to get this far. Humanity hasn't been here very long. The conditions for us to thrive and survive have been really good. We've been smart enough to be able to grow the food to feed us all. But now we're trashing the very ecosystem upon which we depend. And we're trashing it at such a rate, they're saying that what we've relied upon for human civilization to have developed in the last approaching 12,000 years, we can't rely on anymore. And we're not talking about that as being in future generations, talking about our grandchildren. We're talking about us now. And certainly if you have children of the age of mine who are 13 and 17. Now that's just where we've even started. On top of this, we're now adding this massive force multiplier of climate change. And again, I just want you to understand the speed of change. Mike made this point very much earlier on, that slow burns are often not so noticeable as big shock changes. And we are giving the climate a massive, massive big shock change. So let's go back to our energy supplies. The first Western oil well was only drilled a little over 150 years ago here, 67 feet deep. Really not much commercial use because there wasn't anything to burn the oil in particularly. And in fact, if we go back to only 1903, pretty much all the lighting in New York came from whale oil. The first light bulb was invented by Edison only about 130 years ago. Again, a lovely experiment because there was nothing to plug it into. There was no such thing as a grid system. And in 1900, about 120 years ago, there were only 8,000 licensed motor vehicles in the whole of North America. And that probably meant most of the world. There were a handful of them in England and very few anywhere else at all. The first commercial jet ticket was only sold in 1952, 10 years before I was born. And I'm certainly old enough or young enough to remember the jet set, these monstrously rich people who could afford to buy an aeroplane ticket, the jet set who flashed around the world in aeroplanes. The first smartphone only appeared 19 years ago. So if we think just of our light bulbs, remember that it was only about 130 years ago the first light bulb was invented at all. The data from last year that was manufacturing and selling 126 a second in Europe and North America. 126 a second. Remember that 120 years ago, we had around 8,000 licensed motor vehicles in the Western world. The data for last year, that in terms of licensed motor vehicles, four-wheel motor vehicles, there were 1.4 billion of them on the planet, up from 8,000 to 1.4 billion in a little over 100 years. Remember that in 1951, it was impossible to buy a commercial jet plane ticket 70 years ago. Last year, 131 people were boarding a jet plane every second. And that's happened, as I say, in a little over 70 years. And the first smartphone was only invented in the year 2000. Last year, 2.4 billion smartphones were in use. There were 8 billion additional mobile phones in use. As you know, many people have more than one mobile phone. And just think about the amount of energy that's required to manufacture those, from digging out the ore, the rare earth metals, the making of the plastics, the manufacturing process, the shipping, let alone what all of those things use in terms of burning fossil fuels, the aeroplane tickets and so forth. It's producing a colossal amount of greenhouse gas. So these are the data for last year of what we were burning. 245,000 kilograms of coal, 7 million litres of oil, and 116,000 litres of natural gas per second. If you were at 8,000 metres climbing a big mountain, 2/3 of the world's atmosphere is below you even at that point. In fact, half the world's atmosphere lies within only 3 miles of its surface. And 3 miles is really not a significant distance. If you were to take the entire global atmosphere and wrap it up at standard temperature and pressure and park it on the sea or on the land, that's the size of all the gas mantle that surrounds the Earth. And we're putting a massive amount of greenhouse gas into that very quickly. And that means the concentration's going up very, very fast. From around 250 parts per million, only 140 years ago, we're now racing upwards. These are the Keeling data from Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And what you'll find, or you'll see there, is this inexorable rise from what's meant to be a baseline that's flat going on down here. If you're interested, you see this rather beautiful sawtooth pattern, a bit like the Earth breathing, which it sort of is, because the fall in CO2 is spring. That's the plants drawing carbon dioxide down from the atmosphere. And in the autumn, the leaves fall off and rot and release that carbon dioxide. But again, that cycle is meant to be steady and going down here. But it's been compounded by the massive production of CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere and by the deforestation, about which I alluded to earlier. The fact we're chopping down a soccer pitch a minute of rainforest that would normally be drawing that down. And just to put that in context, deforestation alone in the next 3 years will be responsible for the same rise in greenhouse gases as every single aeroplane flight ever taken from the days of the Wright brothers, or will be taken to the year 2030. Let's put that on an historical scale. This is going back 800,000 years. Yes, we've had Milankovitch cycles, we've had cyclical change in climate and in CO2, but this is over 800,000 years. This is what we've done in 50 years. This rate of change is not something to which the planet can adapt. These data were last year, and I deliberately left them as last year because last year we'd already bust the highest that humanity certainly had ever seen, and now you are still breathing the highest CO2 concentrations any human has ever breathed. We've now bust through 416 parts per million earlier this year. It's quite likely we'll soon bust through 418 parts per million, up from only a year ago. That means that we're gaining energy because greenhouse gases do that. They let shortwave radiation in, they trap longwave radiation, and the gain in terms of power is around 1.6 watts per square meter of the Earth's surface across the entire Earth's surface all the time. So just work out what the footprint of this room is and imagine a 1.6 watt radiator in every single square meter and tessellate that around the entire Earth. That's what we're gaining at the moment. And if you turn that into something that's more understandable, we're gaining around 5 Hiroshima bombs of energy a second in our atmosphere that's not going away. And when I say it's not going away, those greenhouse gases we emit today, in terms of carbon dioxide, 1/5 of those gases we emit today are still in our atmosphere warming us in 33,000 years' time. And 7% of them will still be warming our atmosphere in 100,000 years' time, still making us hot. And what that's doing is, yes, putting up global surface temperatures, but there's a massive amount of energy being stored in our oceans. 90% of that energy from those Hiroshima bombs equivalents is going into our oceans. It's causing ice to melt. You can see the loss of polar cap there. And it's causing sea levels to rise. In the Thames estuary, we're now running at 4.2 millimetres a year, every year, and rising ever more steeply, particularly as the Greenland ice shelf melts at an accelerating rate. And we can't predict how quickly or how slowly this will happen, but Jim Hansen of NASA Goddard points out the fact that you can't model it, but what you can say is on the last 6 occasions in Earth's history, when you've had massive polar melts related to greenhouse gas emission events, usually methane venting or volcanic activity, you end up with 70 to 80 metre sea level rise within 50 years. When things happen, they tend to happen very fast indeed. And climate change is a force multiplier for some of the harm that we're doing to ourselves in terms of health anyway. And I relate this to a bit like my sorts of patients here that I look after. Most of them are not young, fit, healthy people who get one thing that pushes them over the edge. They're people who've accumulated a burden of illness, much like our planet has from the activities we put upon it, who then get one more major event, and that's what sees them off. And climate change is that event. Now, in terms of the impacts on humans, the first Lancet Commission we put out in 2008 came up with that statement. And you'll see that it's partly not true, because on its own it's not the major effect. It's because it's acting as this massive force multiplier on top. And our concern about this from the Commission has not diminished. Every single year we produce the new report, the data are dramatically worse. Just to run you through some of the direct health impacts, just out of interest, I put some of the heat data in, because we do report on those thermal stress events and the inability to work. For instance, we're looking at heat wave exposure here. Of course, talking about a few degrees of global average temperature rise on the surface doesn't matter at all. It's what happens where people live and what the extremes of temperature are. And if we look at those extreme heat wave events, you'll see they're dramatically increased. We also know that people can't work hard in very high temperatures. There is a limit to what you can do in manual work in non-air conditioned environments. I'll let you read that methodology if you're particularly interested. So we're finding that even in places where you can still grow food, and that's becoming increasingly difficult in many of these areas, people can't even get out for large parts of the day to even work the fields to produce the food. I put this one in as well because Mike and I have a slight interest in this too. But there's increasing evidence that even these modest rises in CO2 may affect cognitive performance. And certainly they're very likely to for the sorts of levels that we're heading to. And I'll show you those data shortly. Other health impacts, well, there are one's effect on vectorial disease capacity. So dengue, for instance, malaria are transmitted by mosquitoes. All of those mosquitoes, well, if there's more water around, and there usually is, because as temperatures rise, you evaporate more and the water's got to get dumped somewhere. And that plus the temperature rise means that you can grow more mosquitoes in greater areas. They breed faster, they feed faster in higher temperatures, and the parasite proliferates more rapidly in their stomachs. So the load of parasites you get injected with when you get nibbled goes up as well. And that's known as vectorial capacity, that amalgamation. And we can see this going up steeply all around the world, particularly for diseases such as malaria, but also for dengue or breakbone fever, as it's known. We know that crops are failing. Yes, a bit more CO2 means crops grow better. A bit more warmth in some areas means they grow better. But of course, we all know that it's weather events that kill off crops. You can have a fantastic crop year, but if you get a cold spell, a hot spell, or a flood or a drought, the crop gets wiped out. And we're seeing more and more of that. And even the stable projections, we're looking at dramatic reductions in crop yield. Even regardless of that, we're running out of topsoil and water. And these extreme weather events are becoming more and more common because it's adding energy to an atmosphere that creates weather. If you don't have energy in an atmosphere, nothing happens. Everything just stays static. The more energy you add to an atmosphere, the more weather events you'll get, and the more extreme those weather events will get. And we know that they're going up very steeply. And this is a climate change effect. And no one in this audience now will doubt that they're seeing this, whether you come from New Zealand or Australia, being in the wildfires, or California with the fires there, or even the fires near Manchester last year, let alone the fact we had the highest temperatures ever recorded in Western Europe only about 6 or 8 weeks ago, that was followed by the heaviest rainfall that we've ever seen in the month of July in Great Britain and Europe, that was followed by another secondary heat wave and the hottest August we've ever had. These sorts of records are increasingly boring. We hear about them all the time. But they matter. So this is an exemplar it's important to mention. This was 2010 when we had the previously greatest heat wave in Western Europe, centered over Russia, produced wildfires, massive devastation and economic cost, but particularly famine and big impacts on wheat production. And this was the same year I should remind you, the fifth of the entire land surface area of Pakistan was underwater, again with huge humanitarian and economic cost. We'll come back to why that was an important event for other health reasons in just a minute. But let's think about other things like food production. A lot of people are dependent on fish for their livelihoods as well as their own food. A lot of those are in coral reefs. These bleaching events, the ejection by coral of their symbiote zooanthellae, where the coral then becomes white, becomes fragile and exposed to increased vulnerability to wave action, for instance, are becoming increasingly common. It's very unlikely that very much of the barrier reef is going to be left in 11 years' time. It's likely that it will all have gone, very much as the Mesomexican reef. Its 2,500 kilometres is now down to around 11 kilometres left, and pretty much all of that 11 kilometres will have disappeared within the next year or two as well. Let's go back to that other issue of food, because when that heat wave hit central Russia, Kazakhstan, which is normally a major exporter of wheat, became a major importer of wheat. And what that meant was that wheat prices went up. They went up from around $150 a metric ton to around $350 a metric ton in around 12 months. And you didn't notice this in the Western world because the supermarkets absorb the hit for you. They need you to come in to buy milk and bread so that you buy expensive high profit margin stuff like DVDs, toilet cleaner and red wine. If you were poor, you couldn't afford that. And the International Institute for Strategic Studies, which is a military think tank between Great Britain and North America predominantly, were the first to attribute the triggering of the Arab Spring in part to that massive rise in price of wheat. And that's to say that these sorts of environmental stresses that act on humans trigger migration and war. And indeed, long before the British military were making this well known, the United States Pentagon were. And this is just a brief summary from an unredacted report that's now publicly available, talking about a significant drop in the human carrying capacity of the Earth's environment, by which they mean very, 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 very large numbers of people dying. Rather than giving a full 1-hour lecture on health impact, I've just produced a sort of integrated picture for you of how things work. So heat waves produce these massive fires, extensive particulate pollution. We're getting increasing modelling on the impacts of those, causing respiratory disease, increases in ground level ozone. That's not the same as high level ozone, which is good, keeps UV out. This is the bad ozone, causes respiratory disease as well. Increase in polygeneticity and burden. Just worth mentioning here one vulnerability in terms of critical component failure. We are dependent for life to have evolved here at all on having an ozone mantle blocking out UV light, and we're still dependent on it now for our existence. The majority of that ozone comes from one place in the world, which is the Catatumbo Falls in Venezuela, where there's a pretty much permanent lightning arc over that waterfall. And nearly all of the world's ozone at high stratospheric level comes from there. If weather patterns change enough to switch that off, we're all dead in an instant, all right? And there's nothing we can do about that. We are incredibly vulnerable to changes in weather pattern. Anyway, to move on, that's respiratory disease. Ground level ozone drives cardiovascular disease, so do particulate pollution. Heat waves we've heard about producing drought, reduced physical work capacity, but also producing crop production. High rainfall producing flooding, sea level rise doing the same, salt insurgency coming into soil. All those together with ecosystem collapse leading to loss of crops and starvation. Algal blooms, important. Flooding causing sewage getting into drinking water, but also nitrates moving down to interact with chlorine to produce carcinogens, chemical poisoning. Bacterial diseases causing diarrhea, the vector-borne diseases of which we've spoken, but also the poverty, loss of habitation, and starvation together leading to mass migration and to conflict. And this has been warned about by every military in the world to say this is a major and very real threat. We're 1.2 up, we've got another 0.8 in the bank probably, and it's as bad as it is at 1.2. 4 and it's game over. This report from the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in 2011. Devastating because ecosystems won't be able to cope, and we balance at the top of those. But also because it won't stop there. You've triggered feedback loops, as we're already seeing now, melting methane hydrates, loss of albedo surface reflection, driving ever increasing temperatures. So once you bust this, the temperatures continue to rise. So 4 isn't survivable for humanity. 2, we always hear this thing, we've got to stay below 2 degrees because 2 degrees is the safe limit. 2 degrees was never a safe limit. 2 degrees, and I was involved in all those negotiations, 2 degrees was chosen because it was thought to be a target we might be able to meet, that the general public could be sold. It's not a safe level at all. It was chosen to say it's the only one we might have a hope in hell of staying below. So 2's bad, 4 is it's all over. Where are we? Well, these are the emission scenarios. They're known as representative concentration pathways, or RCPs. RCP 2.6 is the one that we need to be on if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees. Now, you'll remember that we've gone up from 412 to 416 parts per million in a year, and we're meant to stay below 421, which will hit sometime in the next 24 months. So that's not happening. Out of interest, if you did want to stay below 421, you'd have to replace every single crop in Europe with a biofuel and have instituted industrial scale carbon capture and storage. So 1.5 degrees is nonsense. There's not a hope in hell of staying below 1.5 degrees in RCP 2.6. 4.5 wouldn't be very good. RPC 6 at 670, we've now got cognitive impairment and a very much worse rise. The one we're currently on is RCP 8.5, which is worse than business as usual. That takes us to around 936, up from 1.6 watts per square metre to 8.5 watts per square metre of radiative forcing. And that takes us to somewhere upwards of 7 degree temperature rise in your lifetimes, you young people in the audience, and in the lifetimes of my children who are teenagers. And remember, 4 degrees is not survivable for any form of human civilization, probably less than that. And that's where we're going at the moment. To get us back on any sort of track for the best form of catastrophe we can hope for, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions next year by 7.8% and do that every year from every year after that. Bear in mind, we went up by 2.6% last year and 1.7% the year before that and 0.6% the year before that. We are increasing our emissions at an accelerating rate at the moment when we're meant to be coming down by orders of magnitude more. So that's where I'm going to stop. It's been a fabulous conference to talk about the physiology, and it's great to hear that people might want to go and explore Mars. But Mars is minus 38% of Earth's gravity. It's a dust bowl, as far as I could hear, with particulates of about less than 1 micron. That's not a substitute for the planet we've got, even if you could terraform it fast enough to live on, which we heard you probably can't anyway. This is the only biosphere we've got that we can live in, and if we don't sort it out right now, your children, let alone you if you're young in this audience, don't stand a hope in hell of making it through your natural lifetime. So this is a planetary emergency. When you hear of Extinction Rebellion talking about it, you hear the Australian Medical Association, Mike tweeted that out yesterday, declaring a climate emergency. When you hear the British government saying there's a climate emergency, they've now got to start acting as if there's a climate emergency. And it makes my heart bleed when I see reports of people flying around the world seriously to do 7 marathons in 7 days, 2.5 metric tons of CO2 per flight. Really? 508 litres of CO2 per kilogram of every one of those 1,000 kilograms in each of those metric tons. 7% of it still warming our planet 100,000 years' time. This has got to stop. Anyway, I'll stop ranting now, Mike. Thanks very much for listening.